All right. So this lecture, let's talk about participation in research. And I want to warn you up front, right? This lecture is going to make you question a lot of what you read in environmental and conservation journals. Okay. We are going to dive into participatory research methods specifically and co production. But more importantly, we're going to learn about how to spot the difference between research that actually empowers communities and perhaps research that just claims to be participatory, right? Uses the right words, has the nice proposal, but it might be maintaining the same old power structures that we're trying to avoid. By the end of this lecture, my goal is for you to have a framework, strong framework, to critically evaluate any study that uses the word participatory and to help guide your own work and research and ensure that it is actually doing what you claim it's doing, right? Because let me tell you, that word gets thrown around a lot. So let's start with the problem, right? So, why does participation matter? Let me give you some uncomfortable numbers, okay? For decades, research, as we've talked about, has operated like this. They fly into a community, extract data, fly out, publish papers, and they advance their career, right? This is called parachute conservation, parachute research, drop in, drop out, very extractive, right? We've talked about trying to avoid extractive. But for the community, they got nothing, right? Sometimes they even get harmed by the policies that result from that research. In conservation specifically, the numbers are pretty stark. Between 30 and 50% of protected areas worldwide were established without free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, from the people living there. They didn't have a part in it, right? Let that sink in. Half of our world's protected areas. And that's data from Brockington and Ego's 2006 analysis. And it's, again, a damning indictment of fortress conservation. So this creates two massive problems. First, and foremost, it's ethically indefensible. Communities bear all the costs of research and conservation while having zero say in decisions that affect their lives, right? Second, and this is what really should matter even to people who don't care about ethics, which I hope you all do. It can also produce terrible science. When you ignore local ecological knowledge and community priorities, your interventions are set up to fail. Studies in community based natural resource management, CBNRM, show failure rates of 40 to 60% when that local ecological knowledge gets kicked to the curb. I mean, that's not just unjust, right? That's just terrible research. That's wasted money, wasted time, bad work. We don't want to be producing this. So, what is participation? It goes beyond just trophies, okay? Participatory research at its core means that stakeholders are actively engaged throughout the research process. They are not just at the end when you're presenting the findings, it's throughout, it's a process. And that includes involvement from the defining of the problem, the research questions, the designing of the study, collecting data, analyzing it, interpreting what it means, disseminating the findings, and taking action based on those findings. But here's the question that's going to follow us through this lecture, right? Who holds decision making power? This is crucial, right? And this is where things get really interesting because you can involve community members in data collection all day long. But if you, as the researcher, control what questions get asked, what methods get used, and how results get interpreted, right? That's not what we call meaningful participation. That could be labor extraction with a participatory label that makes it look nice. This distinction between involvement and actual decision making authority is where most projects claiming to be participatory completely fall apart. And you can think of it as a spectrum, right? So this is a framework that's been around since the 60s, but it remains essential. This is Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. So there's 8 rungs in the ladder, right? And 3 categories. At the bottom, you've got manipulation and therapy, right? These are forms of non-participation dressed up as engagement. The goal here isn't actually to incorporate community input. The goal is to educate people or engineer their consent for decisions already made, right? This is quite similar to how conservation has operated for centuries, right? This is why we need to go beyond just education and outreach programs. If you've ever been to a public meeting where officials already decided everything, they're just checking a box, you've experienced this, right? This is called participatory theater. Now, the middle rungs are what Arnstein calls tokenism: informing, consultation, placation. Community voices are heard, but the researchers or authorities are still making all the real decisions. They're pulling all the strings behind the scenes. So, for instance, you might get invited to fill out a survey or attend a focus group, and your input might even get acknowledged, but someone else decides which suggestions to implement. The top three rungs are where genuine citizen power, communal power, participant power lives, right? Partnership means shared decision making. Delegated power gives communities authority over specific decisions. Citizen control means communities direct the entire process. And this is what you need to keep in mind, right? Whenever you're reading a paper that claims to be participatory, ask yourself where it actually falls on this ladder, because I will make a strong assertion and a guess that most of what gets published that you're reading, and a lot of what gets published as participatory research, is sitting somewhere between that tokenism zone and uh, other top or bottom of the ladder. Now, is this terrible? Are these researchers doing a disservice? Well, not necessarily, right? We're going to talk about how true participation is difficult, right? It's not as easy as maybe I'm presenting it to you here, but again, if we're doing justice-informed research, we need to keep this in mind. If our goal is to genuinely empower and create participation, we need to think about this. There are other contemporary frameworks that have been used. The International Association for Public Participation, IAP2, I like that P2, right? Developed a more recent framework that you'll see used a lot in environmental planning and research. And there's 5 levels, right? There's inform. This is one-way communication. We're telling you things. Consult means we're going to gather your feedback through surveys or focus groups, but we're still making the decisions. Involve means we're going to work with you throughout to ensure that we understand your concerns, but again, we decide. Collaborate starts to get more real, right? This is genuine partnership with shared decision-making power. But empower means you, the community, control the final decisions, right? The community controls the final decisions. This is FPIC, right? Now, here's what you need to keep in mind. Most environmental research claiming to be participatory operates at consult or involve. And again, that's not necessarily terrible, but we need to be honest about what level of participation actually exists in the work we're doing, right? We don't want to call consultation empowerment. A study in environmental science and policy found that only 18% of conservation projects claiming to use participatory approaches actually involved communities in decision making about project goals or methods. 18%, right? The rest involve communities primarily as data sources, or perhaps labor or helping in a kind of maybe more extractive way to conduct the research. Co-production is a level up. Co-production takes participation even further by explicitly recognizing that multiple knowledge systems are valid. Traditional research often assumes that scientific knowledge is going to be superior and everything else is supplementary. Co-production says no. Different knowledge types, whether scientific, local, indigenous, or practitioner knowledge, these are all equally valuable for understanding complex problems. True co-production requires shared problem definition. If you, as the researcher, decide the research question and then ask for community input to answer your question, that's not co-production. Co-production means communities define and help define what problems actually need investigation in the first place. Joint knowledge creation means integrating different knowledge systems throughout the analysis and interpretation stages, not just in design. You're not just collecting traditional ecological knowledge to validate your own scientific findings. You're treating that knowledge as equal or more important in determining what counts as the evidence of how you interpret the results, right? Mutual learning is bidirectional. You learn from communities. Communities gain access to the scientific methods and findings. It's a relationship, right? Both parties evolve through the process. Shared ownership means communities have rights to the data and findings, not just you. You have to set up those processes. You have to be thinking about this in your IRB, right? This challenges everything about the way academia has been set up and traditionally works, right? Where researchers own knowledge and control publication, right? That is the ivory tower model, right? And this is not that. We're trying to break down the ivory tower, make it more accessible. So, a good example of successful co production comes from the Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic. They partnered with climate scientists to better understand sea ice changes. And this wasn't researchers studying Inuit knowledge. This was genuine collaboration, and the difference matters, right? The research emerged from community identified needs. The Inuit hunters reported that ice conditions were becoming unpredictable and dangerous. This was threatening both the safety and food security of local communities. So, these individuals approached researchers and said, hey, we want help in understanding what's happening. The research questions were jointly developed. Scientists brought questions about climate patterns, and communities brought questions about specific locations, timing, and implications for travel and hunting. Both sets of questions shaped the research design from the start. The methods, they integrated satellite remote sensing with systematic documentation of on the ground observations from local community members, traditional ecological knowledge, participatory mapping. The community members weren't just the data collectors, they were co investigators. They participated in interpreting the satellite imagery and determining what changes were actually significant from their deep and lived experience on the landscape. And what came out of this was more accurate ice predictions than either knowledge system could co produce alone. There were culturally appropriate safety tools that communities could actually use right away. And over 40 peer reviewed publications were produced with community members as co authors. This strengthened community capacity for ongoing environmental monitoring. And this is documented by studies by Gearhart and colleagues in 2010 and Laidler and colleagues in 2009. I mean, this really shows you what empowering research looks like. And when we talk about engagement versus empowerment, let's unpack that a little bit further, okay? It's a critical distinction that I need you to understand because these terms are often used independently or interchangeably. So, engagement means communities participate in the research process, like we said, right? They're contributing time, knowledge, labor, but they don't control the decisions. Empowerment means communities gain decision making power and build capacity for self determination. I mean, you can absolutely have engagement without empowerment. In fact, most participatory projects do exactly this. They engage communities extensively while researchers maintain control over all the fundamental decisions. So, how do you identify genuine empowerment? Well, you can look for these indicators, right? First, do communities define the success metrics, or do researchers impose external criteria? If a conservation project measures success only by ecological indicators that researchers chose, and there's no community defined social and economic measures, it's not empowerment. Second, do communities control the resources, including budgets and data? If researchers control all funding and own all data, communities have no power, regardless of how much they participate in activities. And third, can communities say no? If there's no mechanism for communities to refuse interventions or change research directions, participation might be coercive, not empowering. Let's look at, does the project build capacity for community-led action, right? Beyond the research period. Empowerment means communities gain skills, networks, resources for self-determination that continue after researchers leave. And does the project redistribute power or just information? Sharing research findings is nice, but it can be insufficient. Empowerment requires shifting control over that decision-making as a whole. And this has deep connections to environmental research or environmental justice, right? Because this isn't just about research methods, it's about justice inherently. Environmental justice identifies these dimensions that we've been talking about for many lectures all semester, right? The participatory research can really advance or undermine, right? In terms of procedural justice, this is key, right? Who participates in decisions affecting the environment? Research that engages but doesn't empower creates the appearance of procedural justice while maintaining exclusion from actual decision making. You become an advisor to a process you don't actually control. And in terms of distributive justice, which you remember who bears costs and receives benefits, right? Research and conservation interventions, I mean, they typically benefit distant constituencies while imposing costs on local communities. When these communities lack decision-making power, I mean, distributive justice can continue to persist. Protected areas in developing countries displace or restrict access for an estimated 10 to 15 million people globally. How does that achieve justice, right? And deeply, whose knowledge and values count as legitimate, right? Research that extracts local knowledge while treating it as just supplementary to scientific knowledge. I mean, this just perpetuates that epistemic injustice we've spoken about. This happens even in projects claiming to value TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. If that knowledge isn't granted equal status in the decision making, it could just be tokenism. Research without genuine empowerment perpetuates all these injustices. It's not justice informed research. It's extractive. It's extracting the knowledge from marginalized communities to benefit researchers and outside institutions. It can generate conservation interventions that displace costs onto vulnerable groups without giving them control. And it can continue erasure of indigenous and local knowledge systems. It can reinforce existing power inequalities. So let's think about conservation and application as a case study, right? You can see this spectrum playing out in different management approaches. Fortress conservation, right? This is excluding communities entirely. People are threats to nature. And this approach still dominates approximately 30% of protected areas globally, despite mountains of evidence showing that it fails. Consultation-based conservation, this involves communities in planning, but it maintains agency control. This describes most integrated conservation and development projects from the 90s through the aughts, through the 2000s. Collaborative management involves genuine shared decision making between communities and conservation agencies. Notice I said genuine. This requires legal frameworks that give communities actual authority, not just advisory roles. Community-based conservation seeks to go further. Communities are primary decision makers with technical support from external agencies, and the external role becomes facilitation, not management. Indigenous protected areas represent the highest level of empowerment, with Indigenous people exercising sovereignty over territory management based on their own governance system and knowledge. And here's what the evidence shows. Oldacop and colleagues in 2016 published a meta-analysis of 171 protected areas. They found that conservation outcomes were significantly better when communities held decision-making authority compared to those exclusionary approaches. Porter Bolland and colleagues in 2012 found that community-managed forests had lower deforestation rates than protected areas with government management alone. Empowerment produces better outcomes for both conservation and communities, and the data is clear. But again, let's be real. Co-production and empowerment are not easy, and we need to be honest about that. Time requirements are often very substantial. Co-production typically takes 3 to 5 times longer than traditional research. Building relationships, establishing trust, developing shared understanding, negotiating decisions. All of this requires extended engagement. Short-term research projects, it's difficult for them to implement genuine co-production. There's often grant timelines, degree timelines, quick turnarounds that donors and grants and funding agencies expect. That's their norm. There doesn't seem to be a big shift in that space to recognize this, even though the funding agencies will often say that they prioritize genuine co-production. It requires long-term funding commitments, right, which are unfortunately nearly impossible to secure in grant systems designed for defined project timelines. Again, many funding agencies claim to support participatory research, but they're not giving the adequate time or resources to make that genuine. They want participatory outcomes on traditional research timelines, right? It doesn't work. Power imbalances as well between researchers or communities are often deeply entrenched. You bring institutional authority, funding, technical expertise, and control over publication. Simply declaring a project participatory doesn't eliminate these asymmetries. The concept of the community is often problematic. Communities are not homogeneous, harmonious entities. They have different interests, power dynamics, conflicts. Who speaks for the community? If you're not careful, participatory processes can actually backfire, reinforcing existing local power structures, marginalizing women, youth, minority groups. Academic incentive structures, they often reward individual research productivity measured by publications. Co-production requires sharing credit and may produce different outputs than traditional papers, right? If your early career making your research genuinely participatory, that can be risky to your career advancement. And institutional review boards often struggle to evaluate co-production research because it doesn't really fit those standard protocols of IRB and the predefined research designs and researcher-controlled implementation that they believe keeps participants safe. I mean, these challenges are real. We can't pretend they don't exist. So given these challenges, what does best practice look like? Well, first, we can start with community priorities, not just our research questions, right? And this may mean abandoning your initial research agenda for questions communities identify as urgent. That's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Second, we can negotiate power sharing explicitly, and we should. We need to have direct, transparent conversations about who's deciding the research questions, methods, interpretation, use of findings. And we need to think about who needs to be in those decisions, who needs to be at the table. We need to make these very explicit and transparent, and we need to revisit them regularly. They need to be adaptive. Third, we have to provide meaningful compensation beyond these token payments, right? Research extracts value from communities through their time, knowledge, and networks. Fair compensation is recognizing this value. Fourth, we have to build capacity for community-led research. We have to provide training and the methods, data analysis, and dissemination we plan to use, right? This is to create community independence, not dependence on you and the work. And we got to think about long-term engagement. We can't just parachute in for data collection and leave. We have to make real commitments to relationships that extend beyond specific projects and think about funding seriously in this term, right? We might not want to start a project if we don't have the long-term funding. Or we need to really curb our expectations and our plans to be careful about that funding timeline. We have to address internal community power dynamics. We need to understand the communities that we work with. They're not homogenous. We have to actively work to figure out who is a marginalized voice and how can we more actively include them, right? We need to get to know and build trust, long-term engagement. We have to commit to treating multiple knowledge systems as equals, right? This requires genuine humility about your own knowledge, about scientific knowledge, and being open to other ways of knowing, to listening, to understanding, to experiencing. And we have to give communities control over the data and findings. And this may mean that communities decide what gets published, when, and how. That's tough for academics. It may mean some findings are going to remain confidential if the communities choose. You have to be okay with that. We have to design for action, not just knowledge production. What concrete change will result, right? How will communities use these findings? How can they use these findings? Is this useful to advance their priorities? And we have to have good evaluation when you're doing research that's claiming to be participatory, right? We have to ask critical questions. What level of participation actually occurred? How are we going to measure that? Are we going to look beyond claims and abstracts? Or we examine methods carefully, right? Does the description match the ladder of engagement or the IAP2 spectrum we talked about? Who controlled the key decisions? Did communities help define research questions, or were they brought in after questions were set? Hey, we're going to work on these topics, we're going to ask these questions. Was there real feedback? Did you change those based on feedback? Who designed the methods? Who interprets the findings? How were community members compensated? Were they paid as research collaborators or given token payments for their time? I mean, was compensation appropriate? Is it what they would make in a daily wage? Again, who owns the data? Are the community's data owners? Are they listed as that on the IRB? Do they have veto power, FPIC, over the publication, over the project? Are you building capacity? Are they gaining skills that actually matter to them, that they define as important? How long was the engagement? A brief consultation is very different from a sustained partnership. And again, always think about who's benefiting from this research. Does it primarily advance my career and my institution's reputation, or does it produce tangible benefits for the communities that they've expressed they want, right? This will really help you identify, do a gut check, a temperature check of whether your research represents genuine empowerment, or maybe it's tokenistic engagement. And are you okay with that? So let's make this concrete. You want to research, let's say, plastic pollution impacts on coastal marine life and communities. A traditional approach might look like this. You're going to define the research questions about plastic concentrations in water or sediment because you've done research on that. You're an expert. You might hire community members as data collectors, and you're going to analyze the data back at your university. And then you're going to publish your findings in academic journals that you're going to pay to publish in, and they're going to charge others to read. You're going to recommend policy changes to government agencies in private correspondence. But here's how we would flip that script, right? So you're going to meet with communities to understand their concerns about coastal environmental issues. Plastic pollution might emerge as a priority, but so might declining fish stocks, coastal erosion, or mangrove habitat loss. Communities might identify plastic pollution's impacts on their livelihoods and health as the priority, not just environmental concentrations. Their questions might be, how is plastic affecting the fish we eat? Why is plastic accumulating here? And what can we do to reduce this? These are different questions than what you initially set out to ask. But now you're going to reflect on that and you're going to work to jointly design research that's going to address these community priorities. This might combine ecological sampling now with health assessments and source tracking that communities actually care about. Community members are now participating meaningfully in the analysis interpretation. They're not just data collectors. And they're going to help determine what findings matter and what they mean for their own well-being. Communities will control the dissemination, right? Folks are going to decide what findings to share with whom and how. And they're going to decide how to use those findings to advocate for, let's say, industrial regulation, improved waste management, or other changes that are going to address the systemic root causes. I mean, this difference is profound, right? One approach treats communities as research subjects, and the other is treating them as agents directing research to serve their priorities, their needs. But again, empowerment isn't always appropriate or feasible, okay? We need to acknowledge this honestly. Some research questions require independence from community pressures. Research on sensitive topics like domestic violence, corruption, or illegal resource extraction, that may need research autonomy to protect both researchers and vulnerable community members. And empowerment doesn't mean communities control everything. Many projects lack resources and time for genuine co-production. Short-term studies with limited budgets cannot meaningfully implement empowerment approaches. We just have to be honest. But we have to be honest and not claim false participation, right? We have to talk about constraints and the engagement level that we can meaningfully achieve and justify that, right? And think about the consequences. Again, not all research has to or should serve community interests. Some research addresses questions relevant to policy theory or global knowledge that may not directly benefit local communities. That's just not EJ research. It's not justice-informed research, and that's okay. But we just can't be sitting here claiming empowerment when research primarily serves external agendas. There's real risk in romanticizing this and romanticizing community. Communities aren't homogenous, again, harmonious entities. They have their own internal conflicts, power hierarchies, competing interests. Empowering the community might be empowering local elites who are doing harm unless you're specifically looking at power and internal equity, as we've talked about. We don't want power sharing to become performative, right? We need to unpack those addressing underlying institutional power dynamics that might be creating new mechanisms for legitimizing extraction. The most important practice here is honesty. Be clear about what level of participation that we can actually create and involve in our project and why. If you're conducting consultation level engagement, just say so. If your project genuinely empowers communities, well, document how, support that claim, show the receipts. This honesty is going to allow for meaningful evaluation and accountability. It's going to advance this space. But just stop overstating the participation levels. We see this all across conservation, environmental studies, everywhere. It's dishonest and it undermines the credibility of genuinely empowering research. So moving forward, how do we move towards this, right? So just recapping. For researchers, we can invest in relationship building before research design. I mean, you'd be shocked at how much this doesn't happen. This means spending time in communities, building trust, understanding local context before you propose any research. Many funding agencies will allow planning grants specifically for this purpose. Look for those. Use them. Advocate for institutional changes. They're going to support this co-production process. Push your departments, universities to recognize co-produced publications. Reward collaborative work. Support it. Elevate it. Provide training and participatory approaches to others in your field and your department. We can't always fix structural problems, right? But you can work towards institutional transformation one step at a time. Collective action works. Share power and credit genuinely. List community members as co authors when they contribute to research design. It's such a basic thing you can do, but it doesn't get done, right? Share funding directly with community partners, except that communities may veto publication of sensitive findings, right? If that makes you uncomfortable, examine why. And accept that some findings may not become traditional academic publications. Communities may choose to use findings for advocacy rather than journal articles. Alternative outputs like community reports, policy briefs, or media campaigns, that might better serve community priorities. Are you okay with not getting a publication out of this? Your CV might look different, but your impact could be greater. As students, I want you to develop critical reading skills. When you encounter participatory research and literature, use our evaluation to ask what actual participation levels are occurring here that we discussed. And seek more training. Take courses in community-based research. They exist. Participatory action research or co-production. These methods require specific skills beyond traditional research training, and they're valuable. If you plan, let's say, thesis research involving communities, start building relationships early. Don't just wait until it's time to collect data. And think about career paths that are going to support community-led research. Some NGOs, community organizations, especially Indigenous-led institutions, need people with these research skills who center community empowerment. So again, let's recap everything we talked about. 1, participation exists on a spectrum from extraction to empowerment. Most research claiming to be participatory falls in the middle, involving engagement without empowerment. Engagement does not equal empowerment. You can engage communities extensively while maintaining your own research or control over fundamental decisions. Genuine co-production requires treating multiple knowledge systems as equals, not subordinating local or indigenous knowledge to supplemental or, only supplemental to scientific knowledge. Genuine empowerment is going to advance environmental justice by redistributing power over environmental decisions to affected communities. Research without empowerment can perpetuate environmental injustices when it claims participatory approaches. We need to be careful. Participatory research produces better outcomes, it's shown, for both knowledge production and community well-being, but it faces significant challenges, as we discussed, including requirements on time, funding, and institutional barriers. So let's just be honest about what level of participation our projects can feasibly achieve. Don't overstate participation or claim empowerment when you're conducting consultation. And critically evaluate participation claims in published research. Use the frameworks I provided to you today to change how you read research. So I'm going to share some more resources that you can further your knowledge on this in this module. And I just want to close with some questions, right? So think about research that you might be creating, final projects that you've been working on, or something you've read recently. Where does it actually fall on that participation spectrum? Be honest. Be brutally honest. Most research involves less participation than claimed. Second, if you were to make your research genuinely empowering, what power would you need to share? What decisions would communities control? And what makes that uncomfortable for you? That discomfort reveals where the power currently concentrates. It does. Consider your institutional context, right? What structures enable or constrain participatory approaches? How might you work to change constraining structures? And what capacity do you need to conduct empowering research? What skills, relationships, changes in your environment are required? Again, there's no simple answers here, but this ongoing reflection that will help you develop as researchers and practitioners in this environmental justice space, right? We're not ever going for perfection. Perfection should not be the barrier for progress. But we need to be honest about engagement. We need to be careful. We need to create safeguards and good plans. We need to evaluate power dynamics. We need to make commitments to core frameworks and foundations of justice through how we are producing knowledge. And that makes all the difference, okay? So thanks for your attention today. Go tear apart some participatory research, do some critical evaluation, and we will talk soon.